Hi all, and thank you for joining me once again as I continue into the second episode of my Millennial Defense series with me, Sarah, the Millennial Cynic. And today we're going to talk about money, jobs, and the growing wealth divide, and how these issues impact millennials and how they shape our outlook. Now, a lot of what I'm going to talk about here doesn't just affect millennials, but unfortunately millennials are the ones being labelled unfairly in a lot of cases. Also, in a lot of countries now, millennials make up the brunt of the workforce, and as more and more of Gen X reach retirement age, then millennials will soon make up the clear majority. Also, I would like to make it clear that these are just my opinions. I'm not trying to be an authority on these or any other issues. I'm just an ordinary person seeing the issues of the world, just like everyone else, and I am simply trying to explore and discuss some of the more outrageous comments levelled at millennials, and to try to defend our generation. I'm sure there will be many who disagree, and as before, that's okay. I'm happy to hear alternative views and ideas on all subjects. I just feel that millennials are often given a harder time and given advice that just doesn't apply anymore. So with all that said, let's dive in. Too often, millennials are labelled as lazy and unmotivated in the workplace. In fact, the last 2 years of pandemic life have thrown these accusations to the forefront once again, as businesses face staffing issues as the world begins to reopen. Now, I've heard some really bonkers assumptions about millennials in the workplace. That we want beanbags and free food and sleep pods and games rooms. I've heard that we need our hands held just to keep us motivated because otherwise we would just give up. I've heard that we are entitled. I'm sure others have heard these accusations too. And I'm here today to debunk these charges and explain what millennials actually want from a job. Now, I'm going to start with saying something that is quite controversial. Well, controversial to older generations, and not controversial at all to millennials. Okay, we ready? Millennials are the hardest working generation so far. That's right, I've said it. Okay, so I'm going to have to back that up, haven't I? So here goes. Millennials work harder for less money. Money, I might add, that doesn't go nearly as far as it used to. Millennials are often expected to work longer than contracted hours for the same amount of pay. Millennials need a higher standard of education for even starter roles that aren't manual labour. A degree is now often the starting point for a career and not just a nice to have. And even a master's degree isn't a guarantee of a good salary. In short, millennials have to work harder before they even start out in the working world, and then harder again to forge a well-paying career. So yeah, hardest working generation. Now, I've heard it said that millennials expect the world to be handed to them, especially in work, and that this expectation comes from the handing out of participation medals and us being told when we were young and in school that we could be anything we want to be. Now, the first part of that is very wrong, while the second is actually true. We were encouraged a lot and told that if we worked hard and believed in ourselves that we could do anything. I certainly don't think there's anything wrong with that in theory, and I definitely don't believe it has led to an entitled generation. But more on that in a moment. The first part is what I want to dispute first. Maybe the youngest of Generation Y were given participation medals, maybe. But the rest of us? No, didn't happen, at least not here in Ireland anyway. That, for me, is very much a new thing, perhaps starting at the tail end of the millennial generation and ramping up for Gen Z. So definitely not something I feel can be used against us at all. It's just not applicable. Now back to the second point. Yes, we were absolutely told we could do anything if we worked hard. Yes, we were encouraged to believe in ourselves. No, that's not a bad thing to instill in young minds. And no, it hasn't led to entitlement. It has led to frustration, though. Imagine being told consistently and frequently from everyone, from your parents to your teachers to the media, that if you work hard, you'll be rewarded, only to finally graduate into one of the worst financial and economic crashes in generations. All that work, and you enter into an uphill battle in the workforce where you are competing for scarce jobs against experienced candidates while you are a fresh-faced graduate. Now maybe you were lucky. Maybe you got your degree in an industry that wasn't as badly affected by the crash as others. But for most, it was tough. And it remains tough to this day. Access to education, and in particular third-level education, has come on leaps and bounds in the last few decades, which has seen more and more students continue on to college or university. And that is fantastic. However, there is a downside. After being told that if you want a really good life, that going to college is important, many went, worked really, really hard and graduated, only to find that not all degrees are made equal, and that lately a degree will only get you an entry-level job. In some bizarre cases, it will only get you an unpaid internship. Now, thankfully, unpaid internships outside of a college work placement are rare here in Ireland, but they still do happen, and they do happen in other countries. And that to me is just crazy. We've been told to work hard in college for a better life, and then enter the workforce to low or non-existent wages. If you think being a little pissed off about that is entitlement, then you really need to rethink that position. No one is expecting a huge salary straight out of college, but people do expect a livable and solid wage, because that's what we've been told all our lives. And yet, when we get to that stage in our lives, we get to deal with a financial crash, austerity left, right and centre, and cost of living increases the world over, which anyone can see isn't exactly fair. I think one of the biggest misunderstandings about millennials in the workplace is that we are not motivated. It may actually be kind of true, but for the wrong reasons. It's hard to be motivated when there's no end goal to aim for. For the vast majority of the world, a job is a means to an end. If you're lucky, you'll enjoy your job somewhat, or at the very least be indifferent to it. If you're incredibly lucky, you'll actually love and be passionate about your job and be purely driven by that passion, and you'll earn what you need to keep going. But for most of us, it's all about that paycheck. And there's nothing wrong with that. Why should there be? We're constantly hearing mantras like, work to live, don't live to work, or you won't be thinking you should have spent more time at the office when you're on your deathbed. And these are perfectly valid mantras to live by. I don't know any ordinary person in the working world who is just a cog in the system who is genuinely passionate about the daily tasks they have to do and the meetings they must attend. I mean, I'm sure some people enjoy the nitty-gritty of their jobs, but I doubt many of them, if any, would be truly passionate about them. Unless you have skin in the game, for example, you own the company or are a shareholder, then all of these daily chores are just a means to an end. Sure, you want your company to do well, because if they do well, you get to keep your job and maybe even get a pay rise. But overall, nah. You'd be hard-pressed to find an Amazon worker, for example, who ultimately cares past their own security. Why would they care about adding to Jeff Bezos' pocket? So millennials do care about their jobs, but in the eyes of upper management, they care for the wrong reasons. And for some, that's just not good enough. And on this point, we should also take into account that a job for life is now very unusual. In the past and for previous generations, people often only worked in a handful of different companies at most throughout their working life, unless, of course, they changed profession. Nowadays, job hopping is necessary to make sure you are getting paid a good wage and that your skills are being valued correctly. High turnover in that way doesn't do much to foster much motivation amongst the workforce. Work-life balance has become a hot topic, especially over the past 2 years of pandemic life, where working from home became the norm for many, and the literal boundaries were removed. Office workers of all kinds, for example, are often expected to work longer than the contracted hours for no extra pay, just to make a show of working hard so that you can maybe be rewarded with a promotion or a pay rise later. People are expected to take work calls or reply to emails outside of work hours too, which just eats away at any chance of a good work-life balance. Your own time should be just that, your own. But unfortunately, it isn't always the case. Too often, companies will say how much they care about work-life balance in their job listing, but at the same time, their offices will have beanbags and sleep pods and other recreational facilities that sound good on paper until you realise the true meaning behind them. They have all these things not because millennials asked for them, but they have them so that you are more comfortable when you have to stay late. They have all those things so that you can relax at work instead of at home where you should be. And unfortunately, since labour has been devalued in recent years, and by that I mean wages have stagnated, and in some industries it's a race to the bottom in terms of how little wages can be paid before the position becomes untenable, but since labour has been devalued, people are putting up with this arrangement because everywhere is the same. As I said, millennials are right at the coalface in this regard, as we are considered the tech generation, so always online is just what we are. That and the fact that we make up the majority of the workforce, so naturally we will feel these pressures more. But thankfully, the pandemic has made people take stock of the important things in life, and a good work-life balance is high on the agenda for many. People, especially those whose jobs were put on hold during the lockdowns and restrictions, are now re-evaluating what they want from a job. And for many, they are not going to accept the low price tag over their heads any longer. I've heard of businesses complaining about staffing shortages due to what they would claim to be laziness, or that people just don't want to work. This is a lie. Millennials do want to work. We just want a living wage. And when many were forced onto social welfare and pandemic supports over the past 2 years, they realised that what they earn working a full 40-hour week isn't that much higher than those supports. This put things into perspective for a lot of people. They weren't being paid a living wage. They were undervalued. And we cannot allow this to continue. A living wage is going to become a hot topic in short order, especially with the rapid rise in inflation. The cost of living is rising at an alarming rate. Everyday necessities are costing more and more, and wages are being stretched further and further. All while big business is more profitable than ever. The wealth divide is growing wider and wider each day. And with every price increase of utilities or groceries, it pushes more and more people into poverty. Now, this obviously does not just affect millennials, but it is hard to argue that we aren't being squeezed more than others. We don't have the property that previous generations have. We don't have that nest egg or security that no matter how tight money becomes, we still have a roof over our heads. Every time inflation rises, the chances of owning a home and the security that brings drift further and further out of reach for the average millennial. Every time inflation rises, rent becomes harder to pay for. Suddenly, even the fun distractions that we do have, like foreign holidays or our hobbies, are harder to partake in because we have less and less disposable income, and the world and our outlook becomes that little more bleak. Is it any wonder millennials are lacking motivation? No matter how hard we work, the goalposts keep moving for what constitutes a livable wage. No matter how hard we work, our efforts are in vain. We are constantly playing catch-up with no end in sight. The wealth divide is something that will need to be addressed. Ordinary people cannot foot the bill for so many things anymore. Home energy costs are rising, home heating costs are rising, grocery costs are rising, entertainment costs are rising, insurance and health costs are rising, taxes are rising and expanding to include things like carbon tax, housing costs are rising, all while wages stay the same. This is untenable. Big business has to start playing its part here. Wages need to increase and employees need to be valued more. We need more progressive taxation policies so that those who can pay more do. And I don't mean the squeezed middle, I mean the top of the top. We need to give people more carrot and less stick. We need to incentivize working again so that people can actually achieve their life goals. Usually modest life goals. If hard work can't keep a roof over your head, then honestly, what is the point? As I said, this doesn't just apply to millennials. People the world over are feeling this pinch, but unfortunately, millennials are starting from a worse position. As I said in my previous episode on housing, millennials were really only starting out in their careers when the great financial crash happened, meaning most millennials have had to deal with severe austerity right when they were just starting out in their adult lives. Our outlook has been bad since the get-go, and nothing has changed enough since then to improve that outlook. There is plenty that can be done to bridge the gap and to narrow the wealth divide, but it will only be done when the political will is there. Hopefully, as more and more millennials become more and more disenfranchised with the broken systems we currently have, real change can occur as the status quo is voted out and new eyes are voted in. We can live in hope at least. As you can see, I don't have all the answers, but I do know we can't go on like this, and we cannot allow the problems we millennials face to be dismissed out of hand so easily by those who could enact change if they cared to do so. Thank you for joining me and for listening to my ramblings. I hope that some of what I said helps illuminate the strains that millennials are under in the workplace and why they are not just all in our heads. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel for more from me. In the final episode of this series, we will have a look at healthcare and how it affects millennials. But I will also be back with more musings on the latest issues of the day, so be sure to hit that bell icon to be notified. You can also follow me on Twitter to hear my instant reactions to current affairs. The link is in the description below. Thanks again for joining me. I hope to see you soon. Slán go fóill.